Was anyone able to start a drawing of the skull for their painting today?
I did the drawing in advance.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna do a really simple construction drawing. I've mentioned it before, but when I say construction drawing, I just mean using mostly straight lines to make a really simple representation of these shapes here. Curves are harder to draw than straight lines. It's harder to draw an accurate curve. They're just really complicated. It's hard to get it right the first time. And something like a skull, really like the human form in general, there's almost no straight lines at all in the whole thing. I think that's partly what makes it fun and challenging.
Hey, Shane,
Uh-huh.
I can only see you. I can't
Oh,
see what you're drawing. It's on a really tiny little, there we go. Thank
sorry
you.
about that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for reminding me. I know even still it's going to be hard to see this, even if I draw darker than I normally would for a sketch for a watercolor painting, but still, I'm trying to do simple straight lines. It's such a complicated structure that we're going to be painting today. The more we simplify it now, the easier it's going to be to understand what we're looking at, understand what we're painting. And we want to go from general to specific. It's easier to build a more complex painting on top of like a simple foundation. It's a lot harder to simplify something that you've already complicated quite a bit, if that makes sense. So the more the more we're able to simplify what we see here in this stage, we're not worrying about value or color, temperature, anything like that. We're just thinking about the drawing, trying to get the shapes in the right place. The more we can simplify this here now, the less we'll have to try to do that later, and then we can focus on those complex ideas like value, form, and temperature. So again, most of these lines I'm drawing are straight lines. I started out with larger, bigger straight lines to kind of contain the whole shape of the skull. Now that it's getting more complex, the lines are getting a little bit smaller. I might turn one longer line into two shorter ones, and then turn those two lines into four lines to slowly chip away at all these complex curves and forms in front of us here on this skull. And at this stage of the painting, or of the drawing, I should say, but of the painting, I guess, this for this whole process, at this stage, it's really important to keep backing up and looking at the big picture. It's tempting to kind of look at your drawing this close and get it really as detailed as possible, moving from one area to the next. Try to not do that. Try and draw at an arm's length away or somewhere near that, because you're able to see the big picture then. Seeing the big picture is like it's seeing the whole picture, really. Like the spotlight of our attention when we look at something, like what we're able to focus on in our when we in our visual field, I guess we could call it. It's so small that it's that's why our proportions can get out of whack, is because we focus on such a small area at one time. So the more we zoom out and back up, the more we can see the whole picture. and notice any issues we have with proportion a lot easier. So one thing I'm doing is just lining things up horizontally and vertically. I'm looking at this negative shape here in between the jaw and the teeth, lining up the top of this shape. It's a little bit below the bottom of the nose here. The nasal cavity goes down below this edge of the cheek just a little bit. So I'm just making little adjustments, little corrections. I'm correcting my corrections. At the end of the day, as long as it looks like a skull, we should be fine, even if it doesn't look like this skull. It hopefully it looks close enough. When it's a portrait of a loved one, we work a little bit harder to make it really look perfect. This area right here, where the bridge of the nose meets the brow up in here, there's like a softer form shadow right here that meets this really clear-cut light shape on top of the bridge of the nose between the two eye sockets. This is where most of the likeness in a portrait lives. Pay really close attention to all these forms. I'll talk more about head construction later on in the semester, and we'll try out some portraiture with our watercolor paints. But right here in this zone is where the likeness lives. If you can understand this part of a person's skull, then you'll have a much easier time painting their face, if that makes sense. Before we want to place all the features of the face on someone's head, we want to understand these like underlying structures. And the skull is reliable because it doesn't really move around. These are like hard, bonier structures. Something like the tip of your nose or your mouth is kind of everything's a lot softer and it's tends to be in motion a lot more. A mouth especially can be so expressive. It's really hard to get it right, and if you don't get it right, it sticks out more than anything because it's so expressive and kind of fluid. If we can focus on these bones up here as landmarks, we're going to have a much easier time painting those softer features on top of all this structure later on. One thing I'm not drawing right now, this something I always run into with students when we work on a skull is everyone wants to spend a lot of time getting all of these teeth perfect. So similarly to that, what I said about the structure underneath the features of the face, think about the underlying form of the whole mouth. I like to think of the mouth as sort of a sphere. There's a gradient going up and down and also left and right. Those relationships matter more to me than the individual teeth. So don't think of the teeth as being flat and kind of just like one plane all the way across. Think about how it bends around. Actually, I have a skull right here. Let me show you what I mean. You look at this skull right here. I was just talking about the way the teeth kind of wrap around left and right and top to bottom. If I turn the skull this way, you can see that curve from right here, vertically going top to bottom, how it's sort of spherical right here. And then if we look from above here too, you can see going wrapping around this way. It's very, very round. It's not like a flat plane that just has teeth on it. That is going to make your skull look a little bit more like a cartoon skull or like an icon of a skull. So don't worry about the individual teeth. Think more about this larger form kind of wrapping all the way around. And then later on, once we have that built up, we can go in and find those little shapes of positive and negative space, maybe those like little gaps in the teeth. That will kind of help show the individual forms of each tooth. But for now, don't worry about drawing dozens of teeth on there. That's not going to be as helpful. Here's my drawing. I'm probably going to erase a lot of this, most of this, because I want to do some bigger gradients to get us started. And this is just a lot of pencil lines. But like I mentioned before, a lot of this drawing process is just getting to know our image here. It doesn't have to be, I don't have to follow this perfectly step by step, and I don't really need it to stay there the whole time. I can just use it as a way of getting to know the skull. Just sort of like a practice round. So I'm going to erase a lot of this. I'm using the kneaded eraser and just lightly dragging it across the surface of the whole drawing. So I just want to lighten and soften everything I just drew. So one thing, excuse me, one thing I notice when I look at this skull are just like I talked about the underlying forms, like the mouth having that underlying shape that the teeth sort of sit on top of or sit into. It's similar with the light and shadow and the color gradients that I'm seeing here. So even though there's all these individual little shapes going from light to dark to light to dark all the way down the whole skull, before we do that, here, let's zoom out a little bit. Think about the overall gradient of the whole skull. If we think of this as being sort of a one large sphere, here, I have a sphere too. Let me pull this out. If you look at this sphere right here, so this light is a little bit harsh because the light is so close to it, but this sphere, this is the closest area to the light source. It's not really focusing too well because it's, here, let me hold it up here. Let's do this. Okay, that's a little bit softer, a little bit easier. Think about this sphere. The closest area of the sphere to the light source is up here. So as it gets further from the light source all the way down here, there's a gradient going from light to dark. You can see if I put my finger right here, that cast shadow, how that affects things. You could still, if you squint, you could see how that shadow is still pretty unified, all pretty much a similar value. From this cast shadow here to the form shadow here, there is some reflected light hitting right here. My point is, though, there's an overall gradient. Let me grab my other skull here. So this skull is doing a really similar thing, right? Think of the skull as being just a slightly more complicated sphere, but try and squint and notice the similarities here. So regardless of what all of these little planes, these little plane changes and little gaps and negative shapes are doing, the overall gradient of the skull is going from light to dark right here. You can kind of see that form shadow of the skull acting in a really similar way to this sphere. So what I want us to look at today is trying to find that overall gradient from top to bottom, from light to dark. So again, think about the closest area of this skull to the light source. It's probably somewhere up here. We can see a highlight right here, which tells me that the light source is not just directly above the skull, it's a little bit more towards us where we're standing from our viewpoint, viewing the skull here. That's also, I feel confident about that too because of the cast shadow right here. It's kind of angled back a little bit. It's not directly going straight down underneath it. The fact that the cast shadow is a little bit behind the skull, that too tells me that the light source is just a little bit closer to us than the skull is. So that's why this highlight is right here and not directly on top of the skull. Again, my point is all of these light shapes up here are a lot brighter than the light shapes down here. Let's look in Photoshop real quick. I love using this ink dropper tool, and even if it's kind of cheating, I don't care. So right here, this is going to be our light shape towards the top of the skull. Whoops. Down here, this is the light shape towards the middle. And then down here, this is the light shape towards the bottom of the skull. So these are all light shapes. I'm not talking about the shadows right now. I want you to notice that where the light is hitting the skull, there is a gradient to that going all the way down. So to address that in our painting, we're going to start off with like an overall gradient before we break it up into smaller and more complicated shapes, light and shadow shapes, all interacting. I guess what we're not doing is treating all of the light shapes across the whole skull the same. The skull overall will get darker as we move further from the light source. Even though there's still that light and shadow pattern, it will get darker overall. Similar things happen with like a figure. If you're painting a figure with a closer light source, it kind of depends on your proximity to the light source. Like for the case with this skull, the light source is pretty close, so that fall off of light happens faster. If you have a figure lit by the sun is just so far away that the difference between where you're like how close your head is to the sun versus how close your feet are to the sun, that it doesn't really matter. It's pretty negligible just because relative to the distance to the sun being so far away, it doesn't really make a difference. Does that make sense? This light bulb right here in front of me is so close that when I hold that sphere up to it, or if I hold the skull up to it, the fall off of light happens more quickly. Is anyone confused by what I'm talking about?
Makes sense.
Okay, cool. And it'll make more sense when we're painting it, I promise. Okay, so let's start off with that. Another thing, sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you all at once here at the beginning. Another thing I want to think about is like the temperature relationships here. What I want to talk about with color today is warm versus cool, in addition to light versus dark, and kind of navigating those at the same time. I have this very fancy chart right here. You may have seen this before if you've been in this class before. But something I'm always thinking about is value first, so how light or dark something is. So when we did our monochromatic compositions with the ink or with that single pigment, we were just balancing light and dark. We're going to be doing the same thing. And again, light and dark is like our primary focus. We want to get that right because that's how we're going to be describing form. But we can start thinking about color in terms of warm and cool. So warm would be like everything from alizarin crimson through cadmium yellow. Cool would be our blues over here, ultramarine blue and cerulean blue. In between, we have greens. I have Viridian and the Hooker's green, and I also have quinacridone magenta, which is like it's still pretty warm, but it's kind of getting closer to the blues over here. I don't have any violets on my palette, but if I did, they would exist somewhere over here between blue and red. So I've talked about it before, but this palette here is really a like a reflection of the color wheel. And that's why it's set up that way. So instead of trying to mix exact perfect colors that we're seeing in the skull, we want to get pretty close, but we just want to be aware of the relationships. We talked about that a little bit with the limited palette project when we painted that white plastic chair. We can play the warm and cool off of each other and think more about painting the relationships than painting the exact colors. So when I look at this skull and I'm thinking about that overall gradient I was talking about before, I'm also thinking the light shapes seem pretty warm and the shadow shapes seem pretty cool. Even though there's gradients within those two, like the shadows in the eye sockets seem more violet and they get more blue-green as they get lower from that reflected light from the blue-green background. The light shapes are like the warmest up here. They cool off a little bit as they get a little bit darker. So that tells me I want to start off with mixing a color close to this bright and warm shape up here, and then toning it down, getting a little bit less saturated as we move down in this direction. And that highlight is somewhere around here. We could use some masking fluid. Maybe I will. I don't know. We don't have to. If you want to, you can use some masking fluid there. I might even just use a piece of blue tape just for that tiny little highlight. To be honest, I've never done this before with the tape, but it's such like a not very complicated shape there that I feel like I can just rip off a little piece like this. So if you want to use the masking fluid for that, you can. If you want to try this tape thing that I'm trying, not totally sure what will happen, but I think it'll work. Or you could just try to not paint that area too. Because this is all pretty light and bright up here. I'm going to use this 1-inch flat brush. And my goal is to just do an overall gradient starting with like light and bright and warm up here and just slowly getting a little bit less saturated and darker. So to do that, I'm looking at the color and I feel like there's some alizarin in there and maybe some cad yellow. I don't want to make it too orange. So it might be a little bit more yellow than red for like a bone color. Has anyone ever seen the movie American Psycho? It's a really crazy, scary movie, but um, the main character is this really crazy guy, and he like murders people and stuff. But they're all comparing the color of their business cards, and he describes the color of his business card as bone as a color, and it's just one of the funniest scenes. He's so creepy. So if you can see my palette over here, I'm just trying to make sure I'm being really conservative with how much pigment I'm adding, because again, I don't want to just paint this skull orange. I'm trying to get like even the color of the paper is pretty close to what I want the forehead of this skull to be. I might add just the tiniest bit of the quinacridone, just because when I look up near this highlight over here, I see little bits of that kind of a, I don't know, almost like an orange with some magenta mixed in. There's something about this reference photo too that I didn't take this photo myself. I found it on the internet. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on with the colors, with however it was edited to make it the way that it is, but I do really like them. Okay. So this is mostly water. The next biggest ingredient would be cad yellow. There was a very, very small amount of alizarin in there and a small amount of quinacridone magenta. I'm going to clean off my brush. And I'm just going to put some water down first. Lighten my pencil lines even more. If you have dark pencil lines up here, just be careful with putting water over it is really going to lock it in. And again, this is also light and bright up here that they will probably show up. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's something to be aware of. So I'm just going over the whole skull here, covering it with water. And I'm not going to worry about all the complex shapes within it. What I want to do is just get a nice smooth gradient. So remember, it kind of starts out pretty light. Let me show you that thing on Photoshop again really quick. Where did it go? Here we go. From here to here to here. So light and bright and pretty warm. This bone color. Little bit darker and less saturated, and then a little bit more darker and a little bit more or less saturated. But still, look at like the difference between this color and the black here next to it of the background. This is still very, very bright. So don't overdo it with too much pigment or too much darkness or any of that. Okay, so I want to take this color here and I'm going to cool it off a little bit, or neutralize it is another way we could look at it. Might have to make a little bit more first. Does anyone have any guesses on how I can neutralize this bright warm color?
Some blue.
Some blue. Thank you, Bruce. So this is like pretty bright and kind of orange. So to desaturate it, we go directly across the color wheel to the complement. The complement of orange would be blue. So as I add just the tiniest bit of blue here, it's going to get less saturated. It's also going to get a little bit darker, which, remember, thinking about value and temperature. Temperature, we want it to get a little bit cooler. Value, we want it to get a little bit darker. The value of the blue pigment, just ultramarine blue on its own, is one of the darkest on the whole palette. So that takes care of both things in one move. If we wanted to get cooler but lighter, we would have to add more water. Sorry for that glare. It's kind of hard to see, but you can see there's just a very, very, very subtle gradient. I can add even more blue now. This is just kind of looking just like gray pretty much as we get down here towards the bottom. Remember, what we're putting down here, this is going to act as our light shape later on. We're going to make this seem brighter by putting darker shapes next to it, like that cast shadow under the teeth or the cast shadow in here on the jaw. I just lifted out this negative space in here too, because that is pretty bright, even though it's that like blue background that we'll deal with later. Compared to this whole jaw situation here, it is a little bit lighter. Maybe it's a similar value to the light shapes down here. I'm just not sure yet. So I'm going to assume I'm just going to not touch it for right now, and we can deal with it later. I'm going to put this out in the sun real quick because I want this to totally dry before we start looking at any of the shadow shapes. So I'm going to put it in the sun. And in the meantime, I'm just going to clean up my palette here. I'm just dipping the blue rag in some clean water and mopping up these colors. Excuse me.
Sean, can you please review what's on your palette?
Yeah. So we've got quinacridone magenta, alizarin crimson, cadmium red, burnt sienna, raw umber, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, hooker's green, viridian green, cerulean blue, and ultramarine blue. I just switched out the hooker's green replaced Windsor green, which I
Oh,
never really was using. I hadn't used in a long time. So when we did the color charts at our last class, that's what I was kind of experimenting with, and I liked it a lot. So I'm gonna stick with it for now.
thanks.
You're welcome.
Also, I was unable to get the reference. It didn't come in an email. and I can't find it. I just can't find it for whatever reason.
Are you able to open up the chat here on Zoom?
Ah, is that where it is?
I put it there earlier. I'll put it, I just put it there again.
Okay.
And it was in an announcement from a week ago because we didn't have class last week. So
And I didn't get the announcement. Is it, we can't print out from chat, can we?
you
I
should be
don't,
able to download it from the chat.
oh,
If you, I'm on a laptop, and if I like hover over the image, there's
yeah.
with the cursor, there's a little arrow with a line that appears in the top right corner.
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
If you download that, you should be able to print it.
Okay,
And just be aware when you print it, the colors are going to get a little bit darker.
right.
The way the ink sinks into the paper, it's going to look darker than when pixels have light shining through them on your screen. So just keep that in mind too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm gonna go check on my painting.
Hi, did anybody know how to retrieve the recording?
How to do what?
I know the teacher do the recording. How do we retrieve that?
Oh,
Was there a question that I missed?
Yeah, I see that you do a recording, but how do we retrieve that to see it later?
So when I record these classes, I'll show you right now. I post a link to it on the discussion page.
Mm.
So if I go on here, this was from the limited palette. So right here it says demo in all capitals, and then there's a link
mhm.
that should take you.
I see.
There we go.
Okay, excellent. Now, thank you.
Oh, great. Okay. Okay.
So I'll post
you.
today's.
Thank you, Sean. I didn't know where to find that.
Yeah, no problem. I'll post today's demo after class.
Okay.
And do those stay up through the entire course?
Yeah,
Okay,
so you should
great.
be able to always find them through
Okay.
that discussion.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I just got this new brush. It's a 3/4 inch flat. I might try this out today. So what I want to do next, I want to start looking at the shadow shapes. I'm just gonna do like a really light, like a brighter version of everything I'm seeing up there. I don't want to get too dark too quickly. So I'm just gonna make a map basically of all the shadows that I'm seeing on there. Really simple. I'm gonna start out with the eye sockets that are a little bit more, they look very violet to me. So I'm gonna try some of the quinacridone magenta again. And some ultramarine blue. And it looks really saturated. So I might just stick with those too. The more pigments you add to each color that you're mixing, after like, I would say maybe 2 pigments. I mean, after the more pigments you add, the less saturated it's going to get. So if you want bright, colorful paintings, don't choose 5 or 6 different pigments every time you are mixing a color. The less you mix together, the more saturated it's going to be. So I want like a really saturated violet for these shadows in the eye sockets. It's just the magenta and the blue. And I'm just going in really light here. So again, thinking about value and temperature, I'm keeping the value pretty light because I'm anticipating going back later, getting darker. But the temperature, is pretty close to what I want. The temperature being, I'm kind of using the word temperature for color. I love how the light's hitting like the brow of the eye sockets here, and we're getting all these different shapes and angles. So another thing we want to be thinking about right now is the quality of the edge. We were talking about that really the last few weeks. Is it like a sharper, more clear-cut edge like right here? This the bridge of the nose is kind of shooting up from the brow right here, giving us a really sharp edge. Where over here it's a lot softer, kind of rolling back around the outside edges of that eye socket. My paper is still kind of damp, so some of these are bleeding quite a bit. I think that's okay for now. We can always sharpen the edges up a little bit more later. I'm going to use a smaller brush. This brush is really fun, but I'm so used to this one. So right here, the color of the eye socket as it kind of rolls up to like this core shadow edge along the edge of the eye sockets here, it gets a little bit more blue. So I'm going to add some blue. Maybe I'll add it over here on this side. A little bit blue and a little bit less saturated. So to get less saturated now, remember what's the opposite of violet? Going to be yellow. So I'm going to add a little bit of cadmium yellow, just a tiny bit, and some blue. Because it's not just purple to gray, it's really purple to a less saturated blue. So it's like a balancing act dealing with all these temperature shifts. And this whole edge of this form shadow here on the top of the brow, not so much on the bottom, but on the top, this is all pretty soft. So I'm adding water to it. I'm just trying to pull the pigment around, keeping all these edges nice and soft. Really trying to think about how it like rolls up away in this direction. Down here, these are all a little bit sharper. And then in here, there's this like deeper section of the eye socket. It's not, it maybe it's a little bit less saturated, but compared to the rest of it around it, it's a lot darker. So to stay in that realm of that violet color, I'm going to do blue and red, but I'm going to add some more alizarin crimson to this one because it's such a darker pigment. And that's going to make everything feel a lot darker. And I'm adding lots of blue to it too. So I'm just having fun with some of this wet into wet in the eye socket. I'm anticipating going back into it later to darken things up, sharpen up some edges. We're still in that realm of mapping out our shadow shapes. So I'll do a similar thing. And remember, we want to keep track of our edges. So keep those softer edges soft. And then you can push those sharper edges where you want to. So good example right here, the top of this nasal cavity is pretty sharp and dark. Add a little bit of water to make this a little bit lighter. And then here on the cheekbones is where it starts turning from this really saturated violet to more of a desaturated blue. So I'm going to add some yellow to this, which is going to turn the violet to more of a gray. And then I'm going to add blue to try and maintain that coolness of that blue-green that we're seeing. So that blue and yellow will work together to achieve that.
So I have under Chat Admin a training file, admin training tools, and under WFB notes.
So I have like a darker version down here. Up here in this section, I just have a lighter version with more water. So I want to keep all these pretty light. And here too, think about like the top edge of this shadow is sharper It's still a cast shadow here, even though this bottom edge is pretty soft. So I'm going to add some water and just soften that edge. And then it runs into another cast shadow there. But even for a cast shadow, the edges are still pretty soft all around. And then there's just barely a lighter mid-tone on this outside edge over here. So think about how you're balancing the amount of pigment, the amount of water. And focus on, the shape that you're painting, which hopefully is at least partly informed by the drawing we did earlier, what the thing looks like. So the shape, the value, which again is a measure of how light or dark it is, and then the temperature. Is it going from warm to cool or cool to warm? More or less saturated? So this cheekbone over here, this cast shadow on this cheek, it starts out a little bit darker, less saturated, still has some of that gray violet in it. But as we move over, as it shifts over in this direction, it turns a lot more blue. But the value stays pretty consistent. So similar value, different temperature. I'm going to clean up this side of my palette so I'm ready for that. I'm adding a little cerulean blue just to see how this reacts with the yellow. With this blue-green that we have there. And if this gets too saturated, I'm just going to take some of this violet gray from down here and mix that in too. So you can see here, it's like a similar value, but slightly different temperature, just barely. So now as this shadow kind of, remember that roundness of the mouth here, as we get out towards the center teeth here, this is like a little bit closer to us than this. It's going to get a little bit brighter. The shadows get a little bit smaller. So I'm adding some water. The bottom row of teeth are mostly in shadow. There's one tooth that's catching a little bit of light. But for the most part, we can think of these as just all being in shadow down here. It's a little too much water. But keep in mind, all my shadows are still pretty light. I know back here, like where we see the back of the skull through this negative shape here, I know that's a lot darker. I know there's more darkness in the nasal cavity, even in the eye socket still. I'm ignoring most of that for now. I just want to map out my shadow shapes and get them all down, and then I can slowly darken everything as I need to. But it's easier to make things darker. It's easier to make things sharper than it is to make something lighter or softer. So for that reason, we try to keep everything pretty light and soft as we figure out where it's going to go, what kind of edge it might have, and what kind of temperature shifts it might have. Sometimes this whole first layer is almost like a placeholder. So the bottom row of teeth under here, and then the shadow below that as we go down to be like above the chin there, is definitely getting more blue. So just like we had a gradient for our light shapes, going from light to dark and going from warm to cool, the shadows have their own gradient going on. They're starting out pretty warm up here in this like warmer violet zone. As we get lower, they're getting darker and cooler. And from whatever's going on with this background, that like blue paper, that's also reflecting up into all the shadows. That reflection's more noticeable down here just because it's closer to it. So it's reflecting up with just a little bit more power and a little bit more saturation. So I'm adding some cerulean blue to that for that like blue green that's like shining up into these shadows. This shadow over here, this whole side plane of the head of the skull is actually really warm. I think the way the light is hitting it, it's hitting the inside of this cheekbone really hard, and that bright, like warm colored, kind of like what we have up here, is reflecting up into this shadow, making it really, really kind of like this hotter orangey color. So right in here is where I'm looking. That's kind of unique on the whole skull. It's brighter and warmer than all the other shadows. So I might add some cad yellow and cad red for that. I'm gonna clean this up just because it got a little muddy before I fix this shadow here. Maybe cad yellow and magenta is the way to go. Since we're already using a lot of this magenta, you can still see I get like a really saturated orange with that. And I'm mixing this with that blue I have from earlier to desaturate it now as we move up the side of this whole plane here. So I've realized I have to go in and soften these edges here that are a little bit too sharp for this cheekbone. Hopefully it's not too late. But we're getting a pretty good map of our shadows here. And we'll take a break in a minute. Let this all dry. See if I can lift out part of that sharper edge. I just missed that when I was painting it, so that's what I mean when I say it's harder to soften an edge than it is to make it sharper. Taking this warmer color over here into the eye socket just a little bit. It seems like more of a local color thing. Local color means just the color of what it is. Like the local color of a fire truck would be red because it's painted red. So I think there's just a little bit of like a warmer tint on the inside of this eye socket. I'm going to drag around a little bit of this yellow and magenta in the eye socket here. Just because I know I'm about to go let this whole thing dry, I want to just introduce a little bit of that color up in here. Maybe it's too heavy-handed, I don't know. Remember that the cad yellow is going to be really opaque and really sit on top too. So I'm going to be extra careful. I'm going to take off this tape. I don't know if it actually did anything. Oh, it did a tiny bit. But I also kind of like how this just kind of is a lost edge. The whole top of the skull fades into nothing, which is kind of cool too. So this brush is mostly dry and this paint is like half dry. I'm just moving this around a little bit and letting the like half dried pigment pick up some of the texture of the paper. And I feel like that could really show some of that texture of the skull in there. So again, kind of an experiment. I don't really know exactly how this is going to work, but could be a bad idea. Okay, I'm gonna let this sit before I ruin anything. I'm gonna clean off my palette and we can take a 10-minute break. I'm gonna stick it in the sun too, just to make sure it's totally dry when we come back and we can really start to sharpen things up. Yeah, it's 10:30. Let's come back in 10 minutes. Are there any questions before I walk away here? Okay, so I feel good about the overall gradient going from light to dark and from warm to cool. So now I would just want to go in and push the values, the edges, and even some of those temperature shifts a little bit. So one thing I'm looking at is that blue kind of lining the eye socket here up top. You can see it's like kind of like the line of the core shadow. So it's like a really soft transition going from the brow rolling down across like that form shadow. It's pretty soft and smooth into here, but remember that line of the core shadow is going to be darker than what's around it. So it's looking pretty blue. I liked how the cerulean is giving us that like greenish blue earlier. So I'm going to take some of that and a little bit of that cad yellow. And then some ultramarine blue as well. They're really darken it. So I've got this like dark but saturated green blue here. Oops. And I'm going to just move across the eye socket before I get down into any of those violets down there. Definitely have more pigment this time around because I want to go a little bit darker and sharper. These tiny little lines in the bridge of the nose, I'm using the tip of the brush to get really specific about those. And then a lot of those edges get really soft. So now I want to use some water, move this pigment around and try and soften some of these edges where it rolls back over here. So think about how these edges of this shape can really slope off. So I added some water, then I used the rag to take some pigment away. It took away a little bit too much, so I just reintroduced a little bit more pigment there. So however you get to that edge, pushing the blue, pushing the dark, but still kind of navigating those sharper and softer edges as that eye socket kind of like untwists itself over near the brow right here. And a similar thing happening at the top of the nasal cavity here. And I'm cleaning, you might not see it on screen there, but I'm cleaning my brush off whenever I'm going back to add water to soften an edge. So to make sure I'm not adding extra pigment. So now while it's still wet, I want to go back and look at this violet that we started with. A little bit darker this time. And over here next to this in my palette, I'm going to mix up a little bit of that magenta and yellow for that really warm, almost kind of an orange. This a little closer so you can see. So I'm bringing this yellow in here and I'm just going to like bridge the gap between this yellow and the violet with this more orangey red. So think about our color chart from a few weeks ago. I want to be aware of like the speed of this gradient, like how quickly does it turn from yellow to magenta? And I'm connecting them here with this orangey color. And I'm thinking about how that's going to happen now on the paper. Because if too much yellow gets into the violet, it's just going to turn gray. You see up here, as we get higher up, there's a little bit more yellow in it. So I can just kind of, by creating that gradient here on the palette first, I can pick and choose where I want to pick up from. All the while still like paying attention to how exactly how much water is on my brush. So I get the value right. of all the things happening here in the eye sockets, all these subtle transitions from one color to another, different value shifts to one thing that's not happening is any of this turning to like totally black. So that's just one thing to look out for and avoid is just thinking like, oh, there's lots of contrast. I'm just going to make it black and push the contrast, and that will make everything better. That's going to flatten it out if you get too dark too quickly. Remember, there's a lot of light reflecting up into the eye sockets, like hitting like the roof of this little cave that they are. So it's actually lighter in value higher up, closer to the brow. And I still have to go back and soften this edge here, where the bridge of the nose meets the brow. And I'm trying to be really extra specific here about soft edges versus sharp edges. And remember, just because one little area might have a sharp edge, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's darker. It's just a quicker transition. See over here towards the top of this eye socket on the left, there are some sharper edges, but it's not nearly as dark in value as this dark shape over here. Everything happening up here towards the top of this eye socket, there's some sharper shapes, but not necessarily darker. More of just like a dark mid-tone. That can be a tricky thing to balance. So just keep an eye on it. if all of the value shifts and the temperature shifts seem kind of overwhelming and you feel a little lost and you're not sure how to continue, look at the reference and just squint. Squinting always helps me a ton. Everything becomes it becomes more clear on what to do next if you look and squint, because that just kind of gets rid of all the noise, all like the extra stuff, and really just boils it down to what's essential right now. I want to get this smaller brush now. It's the same brush, just smaller. And I want to go in and soften some of these edges in here. You can see a lot of my colors here are pretty exaggerated too. Sometimes if I see a shift from warm to cool, I might push the color a little bit further. As long as the value is correct, all the forms will still make sense. All the plane changes. The thing I'm being most specific about is are those transitions from light to dark, and thinking about, is this a sharper edge or a softer edge? I do want to get those right, because the way that light and shadow interact with each other is what's describing the form. And the way we describe form is how we get this thing to look real. But as far as the color and being specific with color, like I said earlier, I'm trying to paint the relationship between the colors and like kind of playing with that more than I'm just trying to get the most accurate color possible. Because whether you're working from a photo or you're working from direct observation, that's always going to be kind of impossible to get the colors absolutely perfect. Like we will reach limitations with the pigment, and that's okay. That's why in the long run, it's important to pay attention to the relationships. And like when I use the word relationships, I mean warm versus cool and light versus dark. But understanding those relationships and then learning to like turn the dials on those is how you can really kind of stay in control of your painting, or sort of in control, instead of just chasing a photo. So my palette was just getting a little messy. I just cleaned it all off. But I'm going to make the similar colors again, but this blue-green up here. I mentioned earlier, don't worry about the teeth. What I'm paying attention to here are these shadows at like where the gums would be, where the teeth are meeting the skull above it. I don't know what the right word for that part of the skull is. I guess we could call it the gums. But the teeth, like the top and bottom row, if you remember, keep squinting. If you look at the teeth and squint, it's actually a pretty soft transition, a pretty smooth transition from light to dark. The sharpness is up here in that gum area. Painting the teeth on a skull is something that, like, at least I feel this way, that it's pretty easy for a viewer to fill in the gaps of what's going on with the teeth here. And maybe some lost edges or like a nice lack of information in certain areas might be more interesting than just outlining every single tooth that you see, counting your way over to make sure you have enough teeth. If you want to do that, though, you're more than welcome to. But if I seem like I'm like ignoring parts of the teeth, I am. I'm just more interested in like those bigger transitions from light to dark. So I'm gonna look at that now. And I'm just thinking about how this shadow kind of rolls its way up. And just like with the gums above, same thing with below down here. There are some light shapes you want to look out for. But these are just as important as the teeth themselves. It's a little bit lighter going from right to left, lighter in value. So I'm going to lift these out just a little bit. But yeah, if we think of the teeth as a unit, we can see that roundness a little bit more clearly, all that underlying form. Everyone doing okay out there? I hope so.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, either way, I'm happy to be painting, and I appreciate the
Oh,
silence.
there's so much subtlety there.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot to balance, but I think that's what makes it kind of fun. One thing I don't want to forget about is back here, there's that one dark shape that's a little bit darker than everything else. Before I surround it with water here, I want to plug that in. One thing that's useful about that dark shape back behind, like behind the jaw, back of the cranium back there, it's darker and kind of farther away from everything. So I think putting this in, I'm gonna use a smaller brush. Putting this in might create some depth. We'll see what happens. I don't totally know yet, but that might push that back a little bit further and just kind of show us that the skull does continue far back. Sometimes a little shape like that can go a long way, literally. So you see how adding this dark just kind of pushes like that's, if it's like a little tunnel almost, pushes the back of it further away. So now this darker shape, not quite as dark, but the dark shape on the jaw right here, I want to like differentiate that from that mark I just made. And it looks like there's a little bit of red in there. It could be sort of a mirage in the pixels on the screen or something, but either way, I'm kind of open to it. Looks kind of cool. I'm going to use some of this orangey color from earlier. Maybe I'll use alizarin crimson actually. That's probably the better move, the alizarin crimson, because I want to keep it dark. but this will be dark. So that this one is dark and cool. This one I'll do a similar value, but it'll be dark and warm. Let's see if it helps kind of show the difference between this shape right here and then the jaw in front of it. I don't know if that shows up on the screen. It's a little bit lighter. But my point is, like, I'm using temperature instead of value to show that this is separate from that. And then this red shape actually does kind of cool off as it gets lower right here. A little bit less saturated. There's a lot to chase around in here, though. You could look almost infinitely at any square inch of this whole image. So I can use a similar value now to go in and start to carve out some of these smaller shapes in the skull. So if you held off on painting the teeth and you followed along with these bigger transitions, congratulations, you've made it. We can now go in and just punch out a couple of these shapes. Don't want to overdo it. Don't underestimate like how dynamic and gestural teeth can be. They don't have to be perfect. They rarely are. It'd be fun to play that up a little bit. Some of these got a little bit dark in here, so we've got two options. I could lighten these light shapes, or I could push the shadow above it a little bit darker. Usually a combo of the two is a good way to go. See how pushing that darker made that look a little bit lighter. So that was just a little bit of ultramarine blue and a little bit of alizarin crimson to push these darks down here. I lifted some out, but remember alizarin crimson likes to stain, so it's gonna stay there. So I like this shadow coming down here. It's definitely on the cooler side. I'm using this larger brush though, because I just like the gesture of how that kind of falls down in that direction. Went a little too low. But I'm always thinking in brush strokes, one mark at a time. If you think you could do it better with a different brush, then take the time to change brushes. I know it can be hard to make yourself do that sometimes. It seems like, why bother if you can just do it with the brush in your hand? But if you get a better brush stroke out of it, that brush stroke is there forever. It might take you 1.5 seconds to switch brushes. But again, if that brush stroke is there forever, it's worth it. So this back here, where the jaw is meeting the cheekbone up here, there's some more darks that are pretty warm, running into some more of those blue violet areas. Hi, Larry. Is that Larry?
Hi, Shane. Yeah, I just came in for a minute. I wanted to say hi from the South Island in New Zealand. It's about 8:30 here
Wow.
on Friday. We're a day later. It's Saturday morning here.
And
I'll just show you what it looks like. Can you see?
oh my gosh, yeah, that's awesome.
It's it's like a rainforest where we are.
Yeah.
So it's a bicycle trip with a group of people. It's fun.
Take some photos and we maybe you could use it for a painting.
Okay, I will. Thanks, Shane. Have fun. It
Enjoy
looks
the
like you guys are painting a skull.
yeah, we're having fun.
Yeah, oh, yeah, there it is. Okay.
Enjoy the summer
All
weather.
right.
Thank
Thanks, Shane. Have
yeah,
fun.
thank you. You
Have fun,
too.
class. Bye-bye.
Bye. So over here, it's switching a little bit more blue violet. Again, I think I just mentioned that, but again, similar values. They're both really dark. Maybe I should point it out on the reference too. And maybe I'm like, now that I'm zooming in, I'm not even sure that it's there. I might be imagining it, but you see how warm this is looking, almost kind of orangey pink here. This is more of like a blue violet. There's similar values, but different temperatures. Playing those off of each other can make things kind of interesting. And again, now that I zoom in on it, I may have like, I didn't totally imagine it, but I did kind of exaggerate it even in my mind before I'm even painting it. But I think that's just because that's the way that I paint. I'm starting to see things that way. So this class might affect your vision in a weird way. I don't know if anyone else sees what I'm seeing there, but I'm mixing a little bit of that cerulean into the violet too. Remember, cerulean's got just a little bit closer to green in the way I see it. I'm gonna use this smaller brush again to go in and soften some of these edges. So I have clean water on this brush, adding some water in near the edge and then using its tiny little rag just to pick up some pigment. That's how I'm softening these. So my cool section up here got a little muddy again. So again, I'm gonna rebuild this on my palette. That's how we can keep our colors nice and saturated. If they get too muddy, they're gonna be muddy on your painting. Remember, your palette is always just a reflection of not just your painting, but of your thinking. So keep things organized. And if you feel like you want to push color in your painting, number one, just like we've been talking about, you want to think about, you want to like have intention and be thoughtful about what you're doing and why. But it also just might be keeping your palette nice and clean too. Probably a combination of the two. I'm going to soften this warm shadow across the bottom here. So I just went in with a darker dark still, darker than most, except for that shape I put in back there earlier. Darker than a lot of what I had. I'm going to soften some of the edges now, but not all of them. But still, we want to be patient with those darker darks. Even pushing these darker now, it's still like nowhere near black. Still plenty of room to be saturated with lots of color. Kind of like this more before I did that. That eye socket, I'm just going to lift those out. You want to say hi? Yes. Roy wants to say hi again. He's home from school. What are you eating? Oh. You want to wave? Look, there's Dory. You wave? You say hi? Hi. We're painting. You see? What's that? A skeleton. Yeah, skeleton. That's paint. Yeah. I'm gonna paint that. You want to paint later? Yeah. All right, say bye. At this stage in the painting, I mean, we don't have to be done painting it at 12. I think I will be. So with a limited amount of time, I want to think about what's left to do. Or even if you know you're going to be working on it for a while, this stage in the painting, it's starting to get a little bit more finished. So we want to think about what is left to paint on it. And it's important because we want to know what things we're going to like not paint. Something I struggle with in watercolor is over painting things, over describing them. I'm going to clean up this part of my palette. I tried to save it, but it's just a little bit too gray. But if you're like me and you're at risk for over painting things all the time, it's really important to step back from your painting, maybe do a lap around the house just to look at something different for a second and just think about your painting totally detached from your reference, whatever your reference might be. This is hard, like it's hard to do, but you want to think about this just on its own as an art piece. Like, do you have to describe everything? Do you have to copy everything perfectly? What can you get away with not over describing or not painting? I'm thinking maybe the background for right now. I know that's similar to that chair we painted the other week. It's promise it's not too much of a pattern of just like choosing to not paint things, but I'm just wondering if this painting is stronger without the background. It might be. I kind of like how soft all these lost edges are, how light and airy the top of the skull is with how dark and heavy. There's like more gravity towards the bottom of the skull. I think that's kind of interesting. So whatever it might be, have intention with what you're painting and what you're not painting. And just keep that in mind as a skill on its own. Just like mixing or applying paint. We want to be aware of how we're seeing. I could still push that eye socket more. This shadow starts out kind of gray over here, but again, it gets kind of orange in this corner. Careful not to lose the roundness of the skull in dealing with this shape over here. The main function of this whole shadow is really to describe this cheekbone in front over here. So I'm going to start with that. But in general, this whole side plane of the skull, it's not something that we really need to put a spotlight on in this painting. I think most, like I was saying, at least for me, most of my focus in the painting is right here. So there is like an emphasis on this area. There's a hierarchy in the design of my painting. I'm not going to leave this unfinished, but I want it to be kind of a support for keeping the viewer over here. So I don't have to over describe that area, because I don't want it to take away from what's going on over here. This is yellow ochre and quinacridone magenta again. But just in telling myself that like this is really to kind of show me the edge of the cheekbone, that gives this shadow like a job or a purpose. That makes it easier to answer those questions of like, what do I paint versus not paint.
Hey, Sean, it's Joan. I've got to leave, but I want to thank you. It's really interesting.
Cool. Thanks for being here. Yeah,
Yeah,
we're gonna
sure.
wrap this up in a second, but yeah, thanks for being here.
Okay, I'll look at the recording for the rest. Okay, thanks
Okay.
so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. We'll lift this out a little bit. So because I'm not going to paint the background, I chose to make a line there. Maybe I'll continue that down here. Remember, it's a painting and you can just do whatever you want all the time. I guess if we learn anything today, it's that. To be honest, making that line, I don't really even remember choosing to do it. I just did it and then explained it after I did it because that's what we should do because it's a class. But to be honest, sometimes like if you have an impulse to do something in painting, you should do it. It might ruin the painting as a disclaimer, but still, don't be afraid to try stuff. Especially in this class, we're here to learn and grow. Don't be shy. Are there any questions before we're done for today, or comments or concerns? I feel like because we didn't go over the color charts, I feel like I had time to actually finish this demo today. That rarely happens. So we'll probably have a proper critique next week when we look at these skulls. But it was nice to just get into the painting. See right here, as I get into these teeth again, I want to be really, I could go in and paint all that information in there in the photo, but I don't want to. See, even that line I just made. Now I kind of know that's like my boundary. That was one step too far. It's probably time for me to just stop working on this. As soon as you feel that, just a little bit of just like, oh, I think I'm overworking it. Just like put your hands in the air. There's one more thing I want to get back into in the eye socket up here, but that'd be pretty much it. Alrighty, folks. I think it's time to wrap it up. Thanks for painting with me today. And I will post this demo whenever I stop painting here, which should be, I need to stop painting. I should start setting an alarm clock on the other side of my studio at 12, just to make sure I walk away here. Okay, I'm gonna stop.